is a conspiracy. But from that young age, did you originally believe what had been reported in the news?
Not really, because, well, I had a conservative look on it. I used to think that it was Oswald and Ruby and it was a mafia conspiracy, a very conservative amount of people involved, and the agencies were really just the mafia. And what it really boiled down to is my mom and dad were basically conspiracy believers too. They said that when they saw, they could, my dad basically said, I could stomach a lone nut on the 22nd, but the 24th, when Jack Ruby stepped forward and took out Oswald, all bets were off. And he said, he looked at, my mom, and he said, something's wrong here. Something's wrong. And then when they heard the details through the years, now the one thing they did say is, now I have hours and hours of ABC, NBC, and CBS video footage from that day and also the weekend. And they said that, boy, you're showing me a lot of things I did not realize. He said that 10 people could have killed Kennedy that day. We were so consumed with grief that all those details you're laying on me now went in one ear, not the other. And I think that was the success of the assassination, because back in 1963, people believed the government in the media almost like the word of God. And there was no internet. There was no paparazzi or, tabloid press. There was no like this, like today, everything's social media. People check, double check, quadruple check ad infinitum. But back then, it was like, well, the government is saying only 3 shots were fired, and you're kind of powerless to do anything. All you had was newspapers, the radio, and no way to really record anything. So brings us up to the present day. That's a long-winded way of saying, yes, I started out.
No, I completely relate. All we had here was the BBC One news station and a couple of other stations, and whatever they said was gold. So you go on this interesting journey then of starting to speak to Secret Service people. I mean, how does one even approach them? And aren't they prohibited from revealing things to people?
No, when they're in retirement, especially before any books by Gerald Blaine and Clint Hill were written, which were actually because of me. We'll get to that maybe later. But that was at a time they were in retirement, so they were just collecting their government pensions, and it was their own free will whether they wanted to answer anything, answer the phone, respond to me, and whatnot. But again, in the very early 1990s, people got to remember, this is really before the internet. I know technically it was computer bulletin boards, but for all intents and purposes, in 1991, 1992, most people had never heard of the internet. So I was going through old phone directory assistance, newspaper archives, dredging microfiche and trying to find where these gentlemen lived. And so I always tell people, like, David Lifton's big moment in the case was when he got the Cyber Neil report showing a surgery of the head area. That was his big coming out, so to speak. Mine was September 27th, 1992, when I spoke to the head of the White House detail, Gerald Bain, B-E-H-N. And he was a actually pretty friendly guy. He's considered talking to a stranger on the phone. I was only like 26 at the time. And so I was I'll make this story real short. And what really just flabbergasted me, up to that time, I begrudgingly believed some of the things that were laid out by authors, by William Manchester, Jim Bishop, even the Warren Report, that, President Kennedy didn't want the agents off the back of the car. He didn't want the bubble top. Maybe he was a little bit to blame for the lack of security. I started to maybe believe that stuff, begrudgingly. So I laid it on. Again, in mind, it's the number one agent of Kennedy's detail. He had Kennedy's ear. He was there. In fact, he was there from FDR up to including LBJ. So I asked him, said, yeah, I've been reading some of these books, and the Warren Report says that President Kennedy had ordered the agents off the car, and he cut me off. And he said, I don't remember Kennedy ever saying anything about not having agents on the back of the car. If you look at the newsreels, you'll see agents on there. I immediately got cotton-mouthed. I just could not believe what I was hearing. He was only 76 at the time. He was very lucid, very bright, no problems there. And I'm just shocked. He told me something else shocking, too. We'll get to that in a moment about the motorcade route. But the bottom line was when he told me that, and after I got the phone and we exchanged pleasantries, he told me some other things that were interesting. That was the big thing. I got the phone. I immediately started to think about, as a defense attorney, I said to myself, well, Vince, that's tantalizing. That's amazing. But someone out there could say, Vince, it's just one lone man out in the wilderness, albeit the number one agent. How do we know he wasn't senile? Come on, Vin. How do you know? So you got to think like that. They're the other side. Well, lo and behold, when I started to contact a lot of his colleagues from all across the country, again, this is before they were comparing notes so they could go on the internet and see who I was and that, they were all telling me the same thing. It was like they were reading two parts. They were all telling me President Kennedy was a very nice man, never interfered with their actions. at all. Never ordered them off the car, never ordered the bubble top off, never ordered the motorcycles away. One agent told me, Vince, he's the leader of the free world. They're trying to memorize their speech. They're thinking about world events. The last thing they're thinking about is Joe Jones in the back of the car. Is he there or not there? They're not there. They trust the Secret Service sometimes to their detriment. But so that was the big thing. So when people say, well, Vince, what got you into this? Why did you write books? Why did you take it any further? It's because that conversation with Gerald Bain and all his colleagues, if they would have told me something different, even if they were lying, Sean, even if they were lying, I would have said, well, I guess it's time to move on, mate. I guess that's it. Nothing else to say. But it was like, oh, this is going against official history, because to this day, it's like a mantra from the other side. They said, President Kennedy had a rendezvous with death. Meantime, we all have a rendezvous with death. Hello, we're not immortal. But they try to it's like this like romantic thing they have. They try to put a tragic Shakespearean thing to him that he had a rendezvous with death and he was reckless in his social life and he was also reckless in his security. There's no truth to this security. It's also been greatly exaggerated about his personal life.
So as you're unearthing this, then, do you see parallels with the dynamics of ancient Rome, whereby the Praetorian Guard was, recruited to protect the boss, but then became the biggest threat to the boss?
Yes. Oh, without a doubt, Sean. Very good analogy. Very good. Tip my hat to you on that one. Yeah, that's basically what it boils down to. See, that's what I always tell people, and I'm not trying to denigrate anybody else's research. There's some amazing legends, authors. This case done work before I was, even thinking about this case. And what people have got to realize is whether it was the CIA, Hoover's FBI, the Mafia, some sort of combination of them or more, if the Secret Service doesn't do their normal professional job, Kennedy lives. These things are thwarted. They're negated. They're aborted. It's like, okay, we know someone's in the building. Abort. You go on an alternate route, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, to answer your question directly, now Seymour Hersh's book, Dark Side of Camelot. Some people who rightfully, castigate Mr. Hersh. They said, some of the things he wrote about should be taken with a grain of salt about Kennedy, this, that, and the other. But he interviewed, and also on camera on ABC TV, 4 former agents who protected President Kennedy, who I actually all spoke to as well. Tony Sherman, Larry Newman, Joe Palella, and Tim McIntyre, who rode on the back on the follow-up car, right 5 feet behind Kennedy's limo in Dallas. They all conveyed their anger and disgust at Kennedy's private life. Tim McIntyre saying, we have a procurer of prostitutes, meaning JFK, and they're trying to tell us, I'm paraphrasing, to break the law. And you say to yourself, what am I even doing here? Why am I in this position? And you're thinking to myself, my God, this is one of the agents who was there to protect Kennedy in Dallas 5 feet away. And he's showing visible anger and disgust circa 1997 on TV. So that's not just Seymour Hersh's book. Sometimes people go like, oh, Vince, how do we know he really said this? But they're right there on camera, all conveying the same thing. It was called Dangerous World, the Kennedy Years. It was on VHS later on. But the bottom line about this is people ask about motive, like, oh, come on, Vince, why would some of these agents maybe look the other way and action through an action, look at their watch for a few minutes or whatever, and let the bullets fly, so to speak, hit their target? Is because they were angered at Kennedy's private life, although it's been exaggerated a little bit, but still, his view on foreign affairs. So you had that, Cuba and Vietnam, and his view on civil rights. I think it was a mixture of that. Some of them wanted a Texan in the White House, LBJ. And so that's the factors. And another thing too, Sean, I always tell people, sometimes people say, oh, it's been 60 plus years later. What else can we say about this case? Well, it's only been the last 5 to 15 years that a lot of films and photos have been released, digitally remastered, have been authorized to be copied and viewed. And in fact, for a while, Cecil Stoughton and Robert Knudsen, the 2 White House photographers, when they were still living, they didn't allow anything. But when he passed away, they gave it all public domain to the JFK library. What this means is you're finally able to compare and contrast prior motorcades. Because for the longest time, all we had was the Dallas assassination and the inaugural, and very little in between. So you couldn't really compare and contrast. And now I've been able to. If you go to my YouTube channel, it's all there for free. I have one video. It's 2.5 hours long. It's all known motorcade films and photos of President Kennedy, and you'll say to yourself, my God, look at how many times the agents were on or near the rear of the car. Look at how many times the bubble top was on the car, because there's this myth that Kennedy didn't want the bubble top on. Not true at all. In fact, the bubble top was on the car between 1/3 to 1/2 of all of his motorcades, often in very good weather. He's smiling ear to ear. The agents didn't block his view either. There was plenty of room between Kennedy and the 2 agents standing or kneeling on the back of the car. It's just a folklore that people have engraved. We can get into a little more details, but that's just basically, overview.
Have you got two channels? There's Vince Palamara and Vince Palamara JFK.
Yes.
One's got 22,000 subs. One's got 1.6.
Yeah, the other one's more like my music and auxiliary channel. There's some repeats there, but still, yeah.
All right. So for people in the live chat, I'm going to put Vince's channel's link.
Yeah, especially the one with 22,000 views. That's the one that's really made. It's like in the last I'd say last 15 to 20 videos in particular, and they'll see the one about the motorcade routes, and they'll see our motorcade films, and they'll see what I'm talking about. So again, only the last 5 to 15 years, a lot of the stuff has come out. It took somebody like little old me in the wilderness who cared and looked for these things, because sometimes these films and photos are very brief. They'll be in an hour-long documentary, and it'll be like 15 seconds of film of him in Ireland, Germany, and Honolulu, Hawaii, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah.
All right. So you're a young person, you get interested in this. Over time, you start to speak to Secret Service people. My question is then, when there's a stand down, is it completely compartmentalized, whereby, if such and such a person's told not to be there or the routes change, each section they can't discuss what's going on with each other, the Secret Service guys. So there's no way to say, hey, I've just been given this instruction. I've been given this is a bit weird. Is it so compartmentalized they don't understand what's happening?
Well, what it boils down to is a breakdown of the Secret Service structure, the hierarchy. On the Dallas trip, you had the Special Agent in Charge, Gerald Bain, who took his first vacation during the entire Kennedy administration from election night 1963, including November. He took his first vacation, so he was out of the mix. He had the number one guy out of the mix. You had the number two guy out of the mix, Floyd Boring, who was the planner of the Texas trip from the Secret Service point of view, but he was safely home in Maryland, controlling things. And I always make an analogy. Let's have the World Cup or the Super Bowl, depending on your interest in football. Instead of having the starting player, let's have the third stringer. Okay, mate, come on to see what you can do. And that's what Roy Kellerman was. See, he was easy to usurp. There was rookie agents on the trip. There was people that didn't know. Clint Hill and Paul Lance were on the First Lady detail, so they had no way to compare and contrast. This was Paul Lance's first motorcade. Roger Warner's his first motorcade. Clint Hill was Jacqueline Kennedy detail agent. He was on some trips, but a lot of them he wasn't, because it was just President Kennedy. So what happened is it was very easily compartmentalized and kind of pull the wool over certain things, because you had the breakdown of the hierarchy, and they just went with the flow, and they just, I guess on this trip we're not going to have this, because the other major discovery I had is people always ask me what, besides agents not, being called off the limo, that's a total myth. Kennedy had nothing to do with that. The other thing I found out was building rooftops, multi-story building rooftops were normally guarded during, the FDR, Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy administration. It wasn't just because of the assassination. Well, building rooftops were not guarded in Dallas, but yet the trip before in Florida, they were. But again, unless those agents are looking up there and they're too busy looking at the crowds, they're not going to notice, hey, I don't notice any coverage on the rooftops. They're not going to think about it. They're know about it. Their focus is on looking at the back of President Kennedy's head, that whole area, whatnot. And they were fed this bull story that Kennedy didn't want the agents on the back of the car. See, now this is where it gets tricky. This is where I explore it in my first book, Survivor's Guilt, is that on the one hand, many of these agents told me President Kennedy didn't want him on the back of the car. But Floyd Boring, who was the planner of the Texas trip, the number two agent of the Kennedy's detail, he's the one who let the agents know President Kennedy doesn't want anybody on the back of the car for this trip. Again, but yet he's on record several times with me, and also in another source, the JFK Library, saying that President Kennedy never interfered. He was very cooperative. He didn't order the agents off the car. So what it does, Sean, it leaves a very like a sinister burden on Floyd Boring. Wait a minute now. You're on record saying President Kennedy never ordered the agents off the car, was a nice man, never interfered. Yet Clint Hill, during his Warren Commission testimony to Arnold Inspector, said that the one person who told you and the other agents not to ride the car was none other than Floyd Boring himself. So when you have, just making a long story short for your listeners, when you have a breakdown in the hierarchy of the upper echelon of the Secret Service, people that weren't there, third stringers, new people, and you have the number two agent conveying these things to the agents, they might have thought in the back of their mind, this seems a little unusual, whatnot, but it would have been very easy to say, okay, we're not going to have this. Now, keep in mind, even though I find out, wow, a third to a half of all President Kennedy's motorcades had the bubble top, well, that leaves the motorcades that didn't have the bubble top. So not having the bubble top there isn't as suspicious as it would normally be, because it wasn't like 100% of the time. Motorcycle coverage, normally a bracket of motorcycles in a wedge formation were beside the car, right beside Kennedy. In fact, on the prior Texas trips, we know the House Select Committee said it was uniquely insecure. In Fort Worth, San Antonio, Houston, he had all this coverage, motorcycles, but it was dropped down to 4, and to make matters worse, they were behind the rear wheels, so they were totally ineffective. Everybody who sees this Bruder film, they'll see during the section where Kennedy shot, he comes out of the Stemmons Freeway sign, he's like this. There's no motorcycles around the car at all. So there you go. There's no military aid in the limousine. Godfrey McHugh was asked for the first time not to ride in a limousine. He was just there in the prior trip in Florida. Many other trips, he said it was unusual. And they said, well, who asked you? He said, well, it was the Secret Service. They told me to accentuate full exposure not to ride there. Dr. Berkeley wasn't close by. So you had all these elements, and then you had Bill Greer, the driver of the president's car, one of my three major suspects being Bill Greer, again, driver of the limousine, Emory Roberts, who was a shift leader in charge of the follow-up car, and the aforementioned Floyd Boring, the planner of the Texas trip, the number 2 agent. And what Bill Greer did was, even people like Posner and Bugliosi said he was the key to the success of the assassination. Now, they believe Oswald acted alone, but the point being is, his first shot of shots ring out, Bill Greer turns around staring at Kennedy, against training, common sense, and whatnot. Roy Kellerman, the agent next to him, third stringer or not, tells him, get out of line, we've been hit. Roy Kellerman grabs the microphone and is about to say, we've been hit, get to the hospital and alert the follow-up car agents. That's when Bill Greer turns around a second time, disobeys common sense, training, and staring at Kennedy until the fatal shot makes its mark. Only then does he face forward, hit the gas. In 1991, when I was only 25, my first presentation ever in Fredonia in front of Harry Livingstone, George Michael Ivica, Robert Cutler, and whatnot, I pointed this out, and they were like, my God, Vince, I thought he only turned around once. All those years, people were studying this Bruder film, and they weren't looking at Kellerman Greer. They had no interest in the Secret Service. I guess why the Secret Service is secret, as Robert Groden used to say. They weren't paying attention to these agents. I'm looking at Kennedy. I'm looking at Connally. I want to study the Secret Service, the single bullet theory, darn it. So what this means, Sean, for you and your listeners is, okay, you have a breakdown of, and that's 6 to 8 seconds or longer, of him not looking back not once but twice, disobeying an order in training. And then when he gets, before the Warren Commission, he denies it all. He says he never saw Kennedy even one time. He saw the governor, and then he turned around and hit the gas. He makes it sound like he just saw the governor and hit the gas. Well, Bill Greer died in 1985. I spoke to his son, Richard, in 1990 and 1991, and I asked him, what did your father think of President Kennedy? And the line went dead. It would be like, Sean, if you asked me a question, I just sat here like this, like, Vince, are you okay? Is everything all right? So I went on to other questions, and I came back to it. He goes, well, we're Methodists, and JFK was Catholic. Bizarre thing to say at the time, but as the years went by, I found out Bill Greer was born and raised in County Tyrone, Ireland. Only come to this country between the ages of 18 and 19, depending on who you want to listen to. But the bottom line, County Tyrone, Ireland. And we know, not to paint stereotypes, but there's been Methodists and Catholics and Protestants. We've had this whole, bloody wars and religious persecution and whatnot. It turns out the Irish Times contacted me in 2013, says, Vince, we had some information about Bill Greer you'll find fascinating. He was part of the Order of the Orange. So he wore on his sleeve his anti-Catholic feelings. And again, people got to realize, total stranger on the phone. Why didn't he lie and say, oh, he loved President Kennedy and President Kennedy loved him? He ignored the answer, the question. And when he came back, he says, well, we're Methodist and JFK was Catholic. And it rings huge when you look at his actions as a Bruder film. Again, looking back not once but twice, disobeying a direct order. In fact, Roy Kellerman, before William Manchester, author William Manchester, is buried in a footnote in Death of the President. He goes, Greer then looked in the back of the car. Maybe he didn't believe me. And the Warren Commission didn't do any cross-examination on him. They took it at face value that he only looked back once and only saw Connally. He never saw sight of Kennedy at all, which is a bold-faced lie. Anybody who goes to the Bruder film on YouTube would say, wait, he's looking at him twice. He's looking at the fatal shot, makes his mark, then he turns around. So that's what it is. It's all action through inaction. Just take a few seconds. People look at the March 30th, 1981 Reagan assassination video, and they'll see, okay, they only had 68 seconds. agile minds and fleetness of foot is all they had, but they did a brilliant job. I spoke to Jerry Parr, who was the head of Reagan's detail, pushing him in the limousine, doing what they did. But you can contrast that video. I did it in the Coup Camelot, the documentary, with the Zapruder film, and the lack of security,